Welcome to you all this evening to the flagship event of the Canadian International Council, the National Capital Branch. This evening, we welcome over 290 participants from 10 countries across 4 continents. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, the traditional territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. May we honor the Indigenous stewards of this land and grow in right relationship with all Indigenous peoples. We are delighted to be hosting this timely event, offering a Canadian perspective on climate change, especially at a time when the COP26 proceedings have come to a close and we witness the enormous devastation in the West as people are displaced and stranded due to unprecedented levels of rainfall, causing rivers to overflow, towns to be evacuated, and people stranded due to washed out roads. I was told of Indigenous communities that have been without any services and completely cut off from their surroundings. Canada in particular is warming on an average of 2 times faster than the rest of the world. Et dans le nord du Canada, les températures s'accélèrent à un taux 3 fois plus que le restant du monde. Nous verrons certainement de plus en plus de désastres humains causés par le changement du climat, non seulement au Canada, mais à travers le monde entier. To discuss the impact, especially from a Canadian perspective, is Dr. Gordon McBean, Professor Emeritus at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. McBean has been Professor Emeritus since 2015 in the Department of Geography and Environment, as well as with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We are delighted to have him speak to us, given his extensive and long-running career over decades, having served as ADM at Environment Canada, as well as numerous important roles, including the chair of the Science Committees of the World Climate Research Program, from 1988 to 1994, and the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, as well as co-chair of the Future Earth Governing Council from 2011 to 2014. Dr. McBean also helped to establish the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and was a lead author for several of its reports. Dr. McBean is a member of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, as well as co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to the IPCC. We are honored to have you with us, Dr. McBean. Thank you. The session will be moderated by Jérôme Bilodeau. Jérôme est membre de notre exécutif depuis 2017 et a contribué énormément à notre succès en tant que branche du Conseil canadien international. Il est ici ce soir en cette capacité. Jérôme has been working on climate change for his entire career, and most recently at the Federal Office of Energy Efficiency and as an instructor at Carleton University. So Jérôme, thank you for moderating this evening, and over to you to begin the session.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Merci beaucoup. I'm privileged to moderate today's discussion. Il me fait très plaisir d'être ici ce soir. Now, as Elizabeth has mentioned, climate change is a key issue of our time. It is both a domestic issue, but also, as is, of course, the interest of the CIC, it is a key international issue. And we've been reminded of this recently, not only when watching images from natural disasters happening at increasing frequency or intensity in Canada and abroad, but also if we were keeping track of domestic and global commitments in the wake of COP26 in Glasgow, but also multiple others as well. Now, we are fortunate to have Dr. McBean here today. Just a few housekeeping items about the format. So relatively simple. We have 1 hour for us for this today. So we will have a presentation of about 20 minutes from Dr. McBean, followed by a Q&A. For the Q&A, I invite you to use the Q&A box in Zoom to write down your questions. We will be monitoring this box, grouping questions together if they are similar, and then relaying them to Dr. McBean during the Q&A session at the end. So feel free to write your questions throughout the evening, but we will only be going to a Q&A after his remarks. So without further delay, I will invite Dr. McBean to share his screen, and I believe he does have a few slides to share with us. Dr. McBean.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that this is now going to work. And it's always there. So I wanted to start by, first of all, thanking the Canadian International Council for inviting me to do this, and also, but in view of the comments that Jérôme just made, to start my screen off with some examples of tragic events. This is some flooding that is happening just now out in the West Coast, trees falling down, the earlier tornado that hit the Ottawa area, the fires in the interior of British Columbia, and this was a hailstorm that hit Calgary in June 2020. So what I'm going to talk about is a Canadian perspective on climate change and give it a certain amount of international dimension. I want to go right away into the presentation to say that, first of all, to note that we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out, the Working Group 1 report on August 9th, 2021, in which it noted that carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide concentrations were higher than any time in at least the last 800,000 years. And based on this graph here, and you can see these issues, here is what the normal climate would be if we didn't have the warming effects of the greenhouse gas increases. And here is what is seen both in the models and in the observations. The science is very good on this, and the IPCC report says it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. The warming rate globally is about 0.2 degrees C per decade. And we're also seeing that there is heavy human-induced climate events that are affecting many weather and climate extremes, heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, floods, tropical cyclones, etc. We can also note that the global surface temperature has been warming at a greater rate in the last, since 1970 than at any time. And the Arctic sea ice, important to Canada, is at its lowest level since at least 1850, but they probably don't have much data before that. And the Arctic sea ice area is smaller than any time in at least the last 1,000 years. In view of this report coming out, the Secretary General of the United Nations made the statement in view of climate change warming that this is a code red for humanity. This he made in August 2021, in other words, just a few months ago. The Secretary General has been speaking out, and I fully support him in his comments and things, in that he says that climate change is the defining challenge of our time. If he had one sentence to describe the state of the world, I'd have to say we're in a world in which the global challenges are more and more integrated and the responses are more and more fragmented. And if this is not reversed, it is a recipe for disaster. He further commented on other things, and I'll come back to some of those, but I just wanted to note that just after this report came out from the IPCC, a group of very eminent economists put out a scientific paper saying that by 2100, the economic cost of climate change could be 6 times higher than previously thought. That climate change makes detrimental events like the recent heat wave in North America, the floods in Europe, much more likely. And we're seeing that in Canada. We still need a better understanding of how climate alters economic growth, but in the pressure of small, long-term effects, the presence of them, cutting emissions becomes much more urgent. They noted that each person's emissions could well result in a cost to humanity of over $1,300 per year, rising to over $15,000 once the impacts of climate change on economic growth are included. In Canada, we're seeing these numbers of disasters going back, including the famous Eastern Canada ice storm in 1998, wind and rain events in Ontario, the Alberta, Toronto floods in 2013, the Fort McMurray fire, and these are the insured losses, not the total economic losses, nor counting for the effects on humans. But the Fort McMurray fire was over $5 billion. The recent Calgary hailstorm in 2020 was over $1 billion. We're seeing these events happening right now as I'm speaking, and the projections are that these could run up in the 10 to $15 billion range as we go ahead. So in Canada, what we're seeing is that Canada, as was noted, is warming at nearly twice the global rate, with parts of Western and particularly Northern Canada warming at 3 to 4 times the global average. Sea ice in the north is thinning and shrinking, and our unique ice shelves are crumbling into pieces. Canadians are experiencing more and more extreme weather, from intense and lengthy heat waves to suffocating smoke and haze from wildfires to extreme flooding. Canadian scientific community, leading experts in this field, have identified the clear link between climate change and extreme weather events, much of which we're seeing is driven by human-induced climate change, and the effects are evidenced in basically every part of Canada, and this is projected to intensify as we go into the future. So as the chair said in the introduction, the UN Climate Conference is was underway, it's now ended, and I'm going to refer to a number of things. I've added things that I think hopefully put these in context. But just first of all, to note that Prime Minister Trudeau and our new Environment Minister Gauthier talked about the issues, and they talked about Canada supporting fully ending of public financing for fossil fuel projects, deforestation, and to doing this by 2030. Bringing in global carbon tax was pushed, including methane, and working towards zero emission vehicles. Just want to give you some hints of the what is now being called the Glasgow Climate Pact. They importantly talked out right at the beginning. Section 1, science and urgency, recognizes the importance of the best available science. They also expresses alarm and utmost concern, and emphasize the urgency of enhancing ambition and action on mitigation and adaptation, both of them. On adaptation, which is section 2, is where we have the need because of serious concern of climate and weather extremes and their impacts. And as they identify, there's an urgency needing for scaling up of action and support to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, reduce vulnerability to climate change, using the best available science. And they also note, importantly, the needs of developing countries who don't have the resources that Canada still does have to address these issues. They welcome the national adaptation plans that have been submitted to date and encourage countries to submit them further and to further integrate adaptation into local, national, and regional planning. There's this whole section on adaptation finance, which I won't go into other than to say that the provision of climate finance for adaptation remains insufficient to respond to the worsening climate change impacts in developing countries. So let's just look at the emissions. We're going back to the IPCC report. Here's the scenarios that the IPCC carried in their emissions in this report in August this year, in which they looked at various scenarios, from one where you're optimistic and you actually lower emissions down to essentially zero by 2060 roughly, or continue with normal or worse than normal. And how will the global temperatures go? Well, here we are correspondingly with each of these. Global warming, they all are warming because we are warming at 0.2 degrees C per decade. And just instantly, I should say that if we're warming globally at 0.2 degrees C per decade, that means we're warming in most of Canada at 0.4 degrees C per decade, and in the Canadian North at 0.6 or possibly even 0.8 degrees C per decade. So warming in our country is going up even faster. And if you look at even this scenario here down on this track, it only is the only one that gets us even close to stopping at 1.5 degrees C warming. And the others are all going up to 2 or in these cases beyond. I think it's important from a policy point of view, just to bring in a bit of science here at this point. Greenhouse effect has been going on, and it's quite frankly the reason why we're able to live on this planet in the first place. And the most important greenhouse gas is water vapor, causing about 65% of the warming that we presently have. Carbon dioxide is next at about 25%, methane about 10%, and that resulted in the warming of this planet of 33 degrees Celsius. In other words, this planet's which average temperature is about plus 15, would have had an average temperature of minus 18, and we wouldn't be living on it in the way we do now. The important thing otherwise from a policy point of view is to note that the greenhouse gases, when they go into the atmosphere, in the case of water vapor, it comes up, evaporates out of the ocean, out of the lakes, and within 10 days or so, it rains back out. So its lifetime is about 10 days. But carbon dioxide, when we put it into the atmosphere from fossil fuel consumption and burning, it's there for typically, in round numbers, 100 years. And that means that climate change is not just an issue of a few decades even, but a century or more. So we have to deal with this climate issue on a decadal global scale that takes us out to the centuries. And that is very important in terms of the policy issues, because the responses of reducing our emissions will take place, but they will take place some years after the greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced. So another piece of information on greenhouse gases, and this is from the project called the Global Carbon Project, is organized through the international science community of Future Earth. And I just wanted to point out, because it's on this graph, is the per capita emission, the tons per person. Globally, it's about 4.5 tons per person of CO2. If you look down the countries here, the OECD countries they list, there, Canada, 14.2. We're the highest, tied with the United States as the highest emissions per person, per capita, of any of the OECD countries. Oops, back up one. I should note that the non-OECD countries, China, India, Russia, Iran, are all lower than Canada, and Indonesia is higher, but its total emissions are quite small. These numbers do show that Canada's emissions actually have gone down, which is encouraging. I'll come back, and that's in the following slide, just to say that if we look at the information from the Canadian Environmental Stability Indicators of Environment and Climate Change Canada, the numbers show that the emissions from Canada have been going along more or less level to about 2000 to the present, at 2020 roughly, and then they have lowered, this is 2020 here, and we are hoping that they will come down enough to meet the targets for 2030, which is here. And the targets show that if we carry out the things that the government is presently talking about, that we will come very close to, if not slightly exceed, the situation for 2030. It's also important to look at the emissions gap from non-governmental organizations. This is what's an organization called the Climate Active Tracker, and their warming projections global update shows various countries and their various things, and there's Canada. We are resulting in some change in a way, but bigger contributions will come in other ways. So I just wanted to say that overall, we get an average ranking of this in terms of our net targets. Better than, say, Australia, but not as good as Germany or the UK or the European Union in general. So in the Paris Agreement, the argument was very much that we need to take action to try and get to 1.5 degrees C warming, recognizing we're almost already at 1.2 degrees C. So 1.5 degrees C is not very much warming compared to where we are now. We need rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in emissions. This is a critical decade for accelerated action. And we must include methane gas, which has largely not been included in the dealing with the total greenhouse gas emissions. We can also take action which will help in terms of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems, including the forest, terrestrial, and marine systems. Importantly, the Glasgow Climate Pact talks about the issues of loss and damage and the importance of coherent action to respond to the scale of needs caused by the adverse impacts of climate change, the kinds of floods and storms we're seeing now, wildfires, etc. And that we need to strengthen partnerships between developing and developed countries, the issues of funding, technical agencies, civil society, and communities to enhance understanding of how approaches to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage can be improved, because we're not doing this very effectively. In this context, I just wanted to bring in a report that I have used often in kinds of examples like this. This is the whole issue of the World Economic Forum's global risk reports. They put these out every year in January, and this is the January 2021 report. And they rank things by likelihood going this way and impact here. So the ones we worry about are over in this corner. And in 2021, they had infectious disease, COVID, up there in the corner as the highest impacting. It had earlier been down over here. Weapons of mass destruction, also high impact, but their assessment is low likelihood. But the ones that are really up here in the corner, climate action failure, extreme weather events is the most likely big risk. Food and water crises over here, biodiversity loss. These environmental issues are the ones that are most dominant, with the exception of the COVID situation, in terms of their likelihood and the impacts on global societies. And this is within the next 10 years, to 2030 roughly. There's also, these issues intersect with issues of livelihood crises, social cohesion erosion, involuntary migration, public infrastructure failure. And there is these interconnections which we need to work on so that we recognize that climate, environment, societal risks are all interconnected, and we need as society and our science programs and our government actions to address that connectivity. So one of the things we've tried to do in a project I had recently is on building climate resilient communities, which I'll just briefly summarize. This was a SSHRC-funded knowledge synthesis grant where we're not supposed to do original science, but to actually address, synthesize, and prevent some ideas. And it was awarded in 2020 and completed just roughly over a year ago. But we're still working on parts of it. We brought together a team of 22 scientists from around our country, mostly, well, let's say Western University centric, but nonetheless with a good geographical distribution. And we looked at issues like the impacts and adaptation and resilience strategies, focused topics, the heat environment of Canadian communities, with these scientists leading it, the construction code, disaster risk reduction for severe wind, hail, wildfire, and urban flooding, with another team, including engineers and things. Building climate resilience in Indigenous community with Indigenous people, working on this with others to bring together a strategy and understanding of how well, in fact, the Indigenous communities are doing and their experience in doing this. An equally important chapter was the climate change impacts on human health. And here of this team of 6, 5 of them are medical doctors, or 4 of them are medical doctors in Health Canada, Western University, but Dr. Anna Guntz, a pediatrician, child health specialist, led the team on health. We also looked into the economics and climate change adaptation, the barriers to adaptation, and the issues of cities adapting to wildfires and other issues. This report, for those who want to look at it, is publicly available, and its title is How Can Communities Across Canada Proactively Advance Climate Resilience to Effectively Reduce the Risks of Adverse Climate Impacts, Loss, and Damage? And it's on the Western website here, which we can make available in some way. Just some of the issues we were doing and analyzing this whole project was to say, well, first of all, building on the Canadian overall structure of climate resilience, the Pan-Canadian Framework, which came in 2016, the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy Plan in December 2020, which had one of 5 pillars to embracing the power of nature to support healthier families and more resilient communities. We also looked at some of the others. It said as part of this strategy, they would develop Canada's first ever national adaptation strategy. Well, I can say it's still not yet finished. We don't have one that I know of, which is a concern. Importantly, in this context, the Supreme Court made a ruling that global warming causes harm beyond provincial boundaries, and hence there needed to be a role the federal government can play. And one of the issues that's very important for dealing with adaptation is that you need multi-level governance arrangements to address climate-related events on issues and provide advice and guidance for appropriate community actions. And there are communities working on these in municipal plans through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which has these various documents on its website and municipal examples. One of the things we also, as I had said, we really looked at and was of concern when I was reading all the reports from the medical people is how climate change is impacting the communities and the health and the entire society. Local warming and urbanization is enhanced, and you get even more social, health, and economic impacts. And there is an expert community that has developed proven tools for doing adaptation and implementing plans, but local communities usually lack the funding and the guidance from senior governments to plan to be resilient. Indigenous communities are leading on climate change adaptation. We have a project called the Northern Tornadoes Project at Western University to try and figure out where these tornadoes really happen in severe weather. We need to have multi-level governance and issues and levels and sectors of society which create barriers and bring them together with integrated early warning systems and better strategies for hazards and governance issues. And the National Adaptation Strategy, when it is prepared, needs to deal with these issues, but needs to go to action. So it's not just a strategy of discussion. One of the issues that we've seen, and these are reports from the recently published in August 2021, now there was only very recently by the Natural Resources Canada, the National Issues Report, as it says, there are large gaps remain in our preparedness for climate change, as demonstrated by recent impacts of severe extreme weather events such as floods and wildfires. It talks about the need for lessons and good practices, and they're continuing to emerge to help guide successful adaptation. But there is a climate change adaptation deficit in Canada, and accelerating progress is vital. One of the other issues we dealt with in that report, and this was actually led by a team led by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction that I was part of, was the whole issue of looking at disclosure, litigation, and finance, economic and legal issues, and how that climate change risks and opportunities are business issues. Climate-related disclosure drives climate action. The transitioning to a low resilient, low carbon economy requires significant investments. And these investments, though, in climate risk reduction will build resilience. We also noted, the lawyers on the team, that climate litigation is increasing against governments at all levels in Canada, and that climate litigation against the private sector is a potential risk. So hopefully this can be both a driver for action, but also one that makes people do the right things. I wanted to talk about a couple of other more general issues, as I'm running short on time already. Just to say that we are trying to track our footprint of what we do in the ecology by the Footprint Data Foundation led by York University and the Global Footprint Network. And these are being put out, and these documents show that humanity's total demand now exceeds what planets can renew by over 60%. Now in Canada, the numbers are still slightly lower in that we are not exceeding our system. There's also the issues of how climate change and, example, food intersect as issues. the Food Systems Summit, which was set up for a decade of action to achieve Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 by the UN Secretary General, calling for healthier, more sustainable and equitable food systems. And they talked about 5 action tracks. And I just wanted to say that these things here overlap with what we're trying to do in climate change and resilience. Issues such as shifting sustainable consumption patterns, boosting nature's positive production, advancing equitable livelihoods, ensuring safe access to safe and nutritious food for all. And the one particularly relevant and overlapping is building resilience to vulnerability, shocks, and stresses. And there, I've been working with the International Union of Food Science and Technology, the global network of food systems scientists and experts. Now, just to say, I think it's important that to starting my summary in this sense, we have Global Agenda 2030, which is the Paris Agreement, and now the Glasgow Climate Pact, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Urban Agenda. These things all need to work together, and we as society need to work together to keep them addressed in the proper and integrated way. Issues of health, climate, food. We need to bring integrated science to policy and identify better our national roles. International science has all these projects of health, future Earth, climate research, disaster research, and we need to build our national programs to connect these. And just to say, issues like the Global Food and Science and Technology for Humanity organizations, others will work with us on these kind of issues. So we can bring these together so that we have an integrated, interdisciplinary cooperation to address climate change issues for all. As another example of projects is the Future Earth program. We have the Montreal Global Hub, which is building programs on societal transformations for a healthy and equitable planet and sustainability in the digital age. And here's their mapping of where there are various groups of scientists across Canada working on the global programs, over 300 natural and social scientists across Canada. And we want to enhance this, build it up across the issues and across what are called knowledge to action networks, dealing with, for example, emergent risks and extreme events, health, food, etc. So going to the next to last slide, I just wanted to say that climate change issues need to bring together the transdisciplinary and community expertise to address the climate challenges, push the climate agenda, accelerated integrated climate action. And for that, we have created the Canadian Association of Professionals in Climate Change. It's just been created legally, and I happen to be the chair of its board. And we want to enhance the interdisciplinary nature, influence, professionalism, scientific excellence, and overall value of the climate profession within Canada and beyond. And uniquely, the association is the first professional association of climate workers of various sectors in the country. With that, I come to my final slide, which is what I often use in these things, is to note that climate change is an issue of intergenerational, national, and international equity and ethics. We need to reduce emissions and adapt for all now and in the future. We need to do this for children and grandchildren around the world. This happens to be my daughter, and 3 of them are my grandkids. The arm happened to be mine. And as an example of what my daughter is doing, she has an electric car, and she says, who do you want to protect our climate for? Is on her car motto. And with that, I'll just say that we need to go from not just standing in front of the advancing tsunami, but go from reading citations to action. And with that, I thank you for your actions and the attention you're giving today, but particularly for your actions you'll take collectively. And thank you all again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McBean. That was very, very interesting. And it's led to many questions. So we will move on to the Q&A part of this event. We have about 20 minutes to go, and we received about 15 questions. So I'm grouping them in a few categories. And so I think today we can start with a few of them. So I will group them in the following categories. One is science, Second category will be international relations or global equity, I would say. Third category is questions related to policy. And then the fourth is about technology. So I'll begin with science. And the first question we're getting is about your views on the future of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So the large system of ocean surface and deep currents over the rest of this century and its implications if we fail to meet Paris targets.
Well, that's an interesting question. I have a PhD in oceanography, but I'm not the world's expert on this one. But I think we can have to be concerned that, and this will vary between which ocean basins we're talking about. The North Pacific and the North Atlantic have similar circulations, but because of their connectivity with the Arctic Ocean, the responses are both different. And as they're different, they will have different impacts on the Arctic, for example. One of the concerns we have is if we warm beyond a certain tipping point, and exactly where that tipping point is, we're not sure, but which could cause the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which would flood all of that extra water in there, raise the sea levels. And because it is fresh water, et cetera, it will change the dynamics of the ocean and affect that circulation patterns in ways that I'd have to say that I'm not sure that I'm the expert to answer at this point, but it will certainly have implications.
Thank you. So moving on to the international relations and global equity category, we had quite a few questions on this. So I will group them a little bit. One of the questions is about the Glasgow Climate Pact and the importance that has been, at least in recent years, been put in recent years for quite some time, but especially in recent weeks at COP24, like COP26, on the topic of loss and damage and the inclusion of language about loss and damage in discussions in Glasgow. How much more might this require in terms of resources for developing countries, in your view, taking into account the challenges that we have seen in raising a significant amount of funds in climate finance so far?
Yes, well, there were commitments made by countries, including Canada as a contributor to it, for $100 billion. And I gather the amount of money made available was like 20 or 30 billion. So it's very significantly less than what was committed. And we need to make these commitments. As I said in my final slide, I consider climate change as an international issue of equity and ethics. Most of these developing countries did not put any significant amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so this is a problem that has been created almost entirely by, let's say, the more developed, longer term countries. It's not all China's fault. They may be the biggest emitter now, but most of the gas was put there by countries that were developed much earlier than that. And I think we need to address these issues with helping out. And I can say quickly that one of the most interesting, and this goes back quite a while, in 1990, as a chair of the World Climate Research Program Science Committee, I was an opening plenary speaker at the Second World Climate Conference that led to the Climate Convention I think it was in Geneva, I don't remember, but there were 5 or 6 heads of state who spoke at that event, including the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, who spoke very strongly for action. But the one that left the most impression on me was the Prime Minister of the island state of Tuvalu. And as he pointed out, that with 1 meter of sea level rise, my country disappears. We're gone. There's nothing we can do about it, and we're not causing this. And what can you do? And it was that kind of thing, hopefully, will lead to more action than we've seen. And apparently, I saw some pictures that whoever is the prime minister now of that country was in, as we would expect he would be, in Glasgow. And I think it's important that we address this because the implications for the developing world is very, very sad and very difficult.
One of the follow-up questions on this topic was, what actions can Canada and other countries take to support developing countries in addressing these challenges, in addition to or other than financing support? And there were questions related to the role for the private sector, clean energy, and others.
Well, yes, the private sector can play roles in terms of, let's say, the way in which they utilize things that create work environments in a more positive way in the developing world. I think one of the things I'd just like to talk about is, and from my own experience, is I've been involved in international research programs, including one funded by Canadian International Development Research Centre, which funded teams of scientists from Canada. I was the Canadian principal investigator with teams of scientists in Bangkok, Manila, and Lagos to study and try and better figure out how we could protect coastal cities at risk due to climate change. So our cities were Vancouver, Manila, Bangkok, and Lagos. And by bringing the teams of scientists together, I think they benefited, but we also benefited. We learned a lot from working with our science friends and colleagues. I still work strongly with the people in Manila because the learning from each other, the dialogue, the discussion. I was on a Zoom call with at least 3 of them earlier this week. So there's a way in which I think we can work our science programs to have that better international connection. Not that we're trying to encourage, we don't want to discourage, but the idea is not to have them all come here, but to build the science capacity in these developing countries. There's a global program called START International, which was to enhance scientific capacity in Africa and Asia. So they have people on the ground working there who know the situation locally and can work with scientists globally and learn from each other and hopefully give better advice to governments and, let's say, urge people to take the right actions and support the right actions.
Speaking of actions, perhaps moving to the policy category of questions, we've received the most questions in this particular category. You've mentioned that there's a need to develop adaptation strategies. We've received a couple of questions from people asking, what would that look like in your view? What are the top 3 things that need to be done from an adaptation perspective?
Well, I think we need to, first of all, I mean, if you think just simply about the risks if you have of a hazardous event impacting on something, in a simple diagram, which I should have put up on the screen, but I won't, is first of all is understanding the hazard itself, what its characteristics are, what its likelihood of occurrence, what are the intensities and the parameters. But very importantly is to understand the exposure and vulnerability, which parts of our local community. And most of these things can probably most effectively, they have to be done with the involvement of the local community. And working with them is very important. But so we try and identify where are the exposed and vulnerable parts of our thing, what are the properties along riverbanks that might be then hit by flooding? What are the areas where there are poor people who, in the case of a terrible heat event, can't overcome things? So we need to go through and do a systematic analysis of the exposure and vulnerability, having first cataloged the various hazardous events, including, like storms, floods, heat waves, and also, since they're similar kinds of issues, earthquakes, volcanoes, etc. We don't want to restrict it only to climate hazards, but to these other kind of hazards that happen and impact on communities, and then work through and find the ways. And we've been doing this with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction in terms of creating brochures and books and things and say, here's how you make your home more resilient to flooding, wildfires, etc. And these are well laid out and publicly available on the ICLR website.
As a follow-up to that, we're also getting questions about mitigation and what can I think we're hearing a lot of questions about what can individual Canadians do to support mitigation measures, and what can governments, both at the federal, provincial, local, or international level, do to reduce emissions now?
Well, yeah. Well, we can do actions ourselves as individuals. As I noted earlier, my daughter has an electric car. It's a hybrid car, but so it doesn't use as much gasoline. And it is certainly my intention personally that my next car will be electric. No question. We need to go in that way to reduce the emissions, or even better, as my grandson, one of my grandsons does. Well, I only have one grandson. I got 3 granddaughters. but he goes riding his bicycle all the time, or he takes public transit. He owns a car, but he hardly ever drives it in Toronto. So he uses public transit. Let's use public transit. Let's walk, ride bikes when we can, and do things that way so we can reduce our emissions. There's also a project that I can't remember the name of exactly, but basically on how you can make your choices in what you choose to buy. That you look for things that are, let's say, less carbon, carbon created in a sense. And we should be doing these things in terms of our environmental footprint, having indices that show what the environmental footprint in terms of greenhouse gas effects that come out of various products and services, and as society choose not to acquire those, but to buy or use the ones that have less carbon footprint. And that carbon footprint project, the eco footprint that I mentioned earlier, is at least part of that. We can take action so we're not using up as much of the consumptive parts of our ecosystems. And I think governments need to think beyond the next election. The kind of actions we need to take place here are ones that will take literally a decade or each to put in place properly. They need to be planned well, but committed to that we'll actually not just plan it, we'll actually do it and provide the financial support from the governments at all levels in order to make these things happen, and do it in a way that helps all people in society, not just the wealthier ones who can afford it, but people of less wealth who are poorer and need that help to make their home safer, can wherever their work environment is, make it safer. And one area is food. There's a huge food waste in Canada and globally. I forget the exact numbers in Canada, but it's a percentage-wise around the world, and 30-40% of food is wasted. And how can we work together between our food society and producers? And they're very much aware of this at the meetings I've been at with the Union of Food Science and Technology people. They're very much working on this issue. How can we make our food, first, less energy consuming in terms of its production, but also make it in a way that it is not wasting so much that it gets used by poor people and all people who can use it. So there's a net positive impact.
We got a couple of questions related to what I would call perhaps just transition, as well as the national dialogue related to climate action. And this applies not only to Canada, but perhaps to many other countries around the world, that some parts of the country may wish to see very strong and fast climate action, whereas other parts may see some challenges to existing industries or livelihoods. How can we address this and bring everyone together towards solutions?
Well, this is where I think we need a public and open dialogue and discussion on this. That obviously the oil sector, I think it's very important that we recognize that this is a sector which is going to in my opinion, should basically be phased out. But that doesn't mean phased out tomorrow, just walking away, but building in ways and working through it. Because there are some ways in which we can use systems for carbon dioxide capture, for example. We can also reduce the waste in let's say, the burning processes of fossil fuels, certainly not using coal, but using other things. And we have windmills and electric power from hydroelectric plants and things we should be using in place of, and we should use those and make investments from our governments at various levels in creating that green energy part of the sector and enhancing it in a way that it creates jobs and creates let's say overall benefits for the climate system and environment, but creates societal benefits in terms of the quality of normally. I mean, another issue related to this is much of the fossil fuel consumption leads to poor air quality, and air quality is a major cause of human health problems and deaths in Canada and around the world. I mean, just the news the other day, of course, in Delhi, in India, they're having to close the city almost because of the amount of smog and smoke that comes from all of these coal-fired things. And our situation is much better, but it's not perfect. So we need to look at the human and related impacts in that way. I think more jobs created for in this sector can lead to more amplification and encouraging the creation of these kind of sectors, which means reducing the jobs in the fossil fuel sector.
I'm looking at the time and mindful of it. I will move on to the category technology. So we've got a few questions related to that. The first one perhaps is about both measurement and also forecasting. So we have a question about whether you see improvements in the forecasting of extreme events. And of course, we're seeing quite a few right now. And I'll add the second question right away is, are we adequately observing our environment? And so the question was, variables such as methane, aerosols, precipitation, are we adequately measuring emissions? So we have a clear sense of not only what the scale of the problem is today, but also forecasting future events.
Well, I'd like to say that as the ex-head of the Weather Service, I have some experience in this. And what I think is so important is that we have the resources to better observe. And we've put in a network, for example, for precipitation and rain of Doppler weather radars across country. When I was the assistant deputy minister, I think we had 3 in the country. We agreed before I left to put in up to about 35 of them. And I'm involved in a project looking at hailstorms in Calgary and using the improved, newly upgraded Strathmore radar, which is there. And we can use those kinds of technologies to better observe, and also satellite-based technologies to observe the weather with more detail, and then working with our, the meteorological and the technology wizards come up with better computer forecast models that will project these models ahead. I mean, the science there is relatively good. It needs some improvements, of course, but there are opportunities to, as I say, to better inform our citizens at all the times about the weather, climate, air pollution, and their implication events, and find a way of communicating this most effectively so that most people hear it, and they not only hear it, but they understand what it means in terms of actions. One of the sad situations that happens occasionally, but shouldn't happen at all, is when we've had tornado warnings. I've seen pictures on the media of people standing with their kids on the back deck of the house, looking out and showing the kids how, oh, isn't that neat? There's a tornado coming right towards us. And they should not be standing out there. They should know enough to get to the basement, to their safe spot, and that kind of thing. So the whole question of communication is very important, both in terms of the words that are used, but the way in which it's done so that people get the information and can take the appropriate actions for it. But the technology is, I think, largely there. It's just a case of costs of implementation. And one of the things is that I mentioned this Northern Tornadoes project. When we designed that network of radars, we put them where we expected tornadoes to happen, where are happening now. But as the climate warms, they will happen further north and in other places where they're not so likely now. And we need to hence extend our networks of observations programs and that kind of thing. So we have even more information on which to base the predictions, the warnings, and the advice to all citizens.
We're also getting questions related to certain emerging technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and other types of technologies that can either reduce emissions or take, maybe perhaps in the future, suck them away from the atmosphere. If you have specific thoughts on those emerging technologies and some that you see as particularly promising.
Yes, I'd say that the situation there is improving. Years ago, I was quite opposed to this because the main technologies people proposed a decade or more ago was to put all kinds of pollution up in the stratosphere, which was supposed to reduce the amount of sunlight coming in, and that was known as that was going to reduce the global warming that way. And I was totally opposed to that because it created other environmental issues. But the idea of carbon capture, where you can, and I don't know enough about the technology to be 100% sure, but people I know who do study these say, yes, this is a positive way of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The question then is, where do you store it, or what can you, there are ways of using it then, I'm being told, that you could convert it into something that's useful. But you got to be very careful with it. I mean, we've have a problem in Canada with nuclear power stations, and that we've been storing the used, let's say, nuclear fuel for decades in big vats without any final decision of where we put it. And we want to make sure that with CO2, we don't end up with a similar problem. But I think there is opportunities there that people who know about the technology and the risks of doing these things are addressing fairly well. So I think there are opportunities there.
I think I will go for our last question, and it doesn't fit in any category quite neatly, but we had a few questions from people about different professions that can contribute to the fight against climate change. And I know in your presentation, you mentioned, in your view, the importance of having a diversity of voices, and you talked about that organization that you recently launched and are now chairing. Just wanted to hear a little bit more from you about that topic and the importance of bringing people from various professions and various walks of life into this discussion.
Yes, that's very important. Thank you. The important issue is we have the natural scientists degrees in, let's say, physics and math and that kind of biology. But we need to have economists, we need to have sociologists, psychologists, people who know how to deal so that people understand how people respond to these things. We need to have lawyers to address these issues of litigation, liability, etc. Engineers and technologists in order to better come up with technologies that are less, let's say, power consuming and things. So what we're looking for, if you take a standard university, is we need people from basically every part of the campus to not to become less an expert in their own field, but to be able to communicate and be encouraged to intersect and work with people across these disciplines. And I'd have to say that in my experience in academia is not always that positive in that sense, that the idea of being encouraged to deal with something, I mean, outside your discipline is not where you get a big research grant or a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So, but we need to have the way of encouraging this interdisciplinary thing where it's bringing together the people who are very good in their field, but they also understand and want to understand and work together with people who are equally competent in, say, economics, with engineers, with medical people, with natural scientists, with psychologists. And that's been very beneficial, I think, and can make a big difference. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. McBean, for this presentation and for your answers to so many questions we've received. We couldn't get to all of them. So it really displays, I think, the importance and the interest that there is in this topic. And I'm sure, as you just mentioned, in the 128 participants I see online right now, they're not all climate scientists. We have people from all professions and walks of life. So your point is especially well taken by this particular crowd. So thank you very much. I will ask Elizabeth to offer some closing remarks, please.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. McBean and Jérôme, for a most compelling presentation and discussion. It's important that we all have the facts before us and to recognize the impact that climate change will have on all of our lives. And I very much appreciate the holistic approach that you are expressing, that it is not only for the scientists, it's for all of us, it's for all humanity to come together to do what we can, to pull together, to do what we can to mitigate otherwise the overwhelming impact that we see that climate change does have on this planet. As the UN Secretary General said, that it's the defining challenge of our time. It's the code red for humanity. So I really would like to thank you so much for this presentation. I would also like to thank Hamid Georgiani, our program director, who has done excellent work, not only in organizing the session, but also in his time as program director. We are just so grateful for all the work that Hamid has done over the time that he has assumed that role. I'd also like to thank Caroline and Sam for their logistical, technical, and communications assistance. Could not put the caliber of these presentations on without you all, and thank you so much for your wonderful work. I'd like to point out that the presentation will be available on YouTube, and it can then be, we can share the link with all of the participants. There have been some questions as to whether or not this will be available, and yes, we're delighted to say that it will be. What I might also do, if you agree, Dr. McBean, is to perhaps send you some of the questions that people weren't able to be expressed on the screen, so that if you have any other comments, we can certainly reach out to these individuals. But also for you to see just very much the tremendous interest and concern that we all have and share. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to wish you all a good evening, and also thank you all for your support of the Canadian International Council. And if you're not already, I would encourage you to become a member and to be able to participate in continued sessions of this nature. So thank you all very much, and good evening.
Thank you.